Well, thank you all for coming. It's a wonderful turnout, and I hope it stays this cool throughout the whole presentation. Tonight's speaker is Sebastian Junger, a Massachusetts native and a writer who recently accomplished his first book called The Perfect Storm. That's the story, as we all know, of the famous no-name storm of 1991. And today, that book appears as number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. In his work as a journalist, Mr. Junger has traveled to such dangerous places as the front lines of Bosnia. In fact, he specializes in dangerous assignments. But the success of his book seems to have changed his lifestyle just a little bit. Yesterday, the Salem Evening News quoted Mr. Junger as saying that his book's success is making him lead a different sort of lifestyle, one that he's not particularly fond of. While I'm glad he doesn't consider this to be a dangerous assignment, I'm sure that at least he will make this evening enjoyable for all of us. So please join me in welcoming Sebastian Junger.
Thank you very much. Someone recently asked me if writing this book has given me a fear of the sea. And I'm sort of looking out at this sea of faces, and I said, no, but it's given me a new fear of public speaking. So you'll have to be patient. I'm new at this, but I'm starting to enjoy it, actually. It's for a lot of my life as a writer, I would write things, and I would never get a response from people. They were in small publications. I would never hear back about what. And that's the worst thing in the world as a writer. There's almost nothing worse. Maybe worse than not write at all. And so finally, I'm just getting this sort of bounty of response from people. It's making up for 10 years of being what at the time felt like a failed writer. And even a few years ago, when the storm hit, I was not making a living as a journalist. I was working as a high climber taking trees down. And it gave me an interest in dangerous jobs because on one tree, and not even a dangerous tree, interestingly, it was a very mundane little elm tree. I've never described a tree as mundane, but there you have it. It was a mundane little elm tree, and I wasn't paying attention, and the saw jumped. The tip of the saw hit something and jumped and hit the back of my leg and just tore up the back of my leg. I was able to open the cut up and see my Achilles tendon. And I did that because I used to run marathons, and the first thing that went through my mind was, oh my God, my Achilles tendon, because I had heard, I don't know if this is true, I had heard if you cut the Achilles, it rolls up like a window shade. Well, I didn't cut the Achilles, but I could see it. And so I rappelled down out of the tree, and I was swearing my head off. I was really angry with myself for having done that. And because usually when people get hurt, it's because they were stupid, not because they're taking risks. When people take risks and they think they're taking risks, they're really careful. I was just sloppy, and I got 18 stitches for it. And a month later, I was still limping around, trying to recover from this thing and contemplating a book on dangerous jobs, writing a book on dangerous jobs. It felt like people didn't pay enough attention to men and women who did dangerous work. You have loggers, high steel construction, oil rigs, that kind of thing. All the things that society needs to function, fishermen, forest firefighters, I mean, there's quite a list. All the things society needs to function, and no one stops to think while they're working in an office building 20 stories up, my God, some guy was straddling an I-beam, 800 feet above the pavement, bolting this thing together right where I'm sitting, and I'm sitting here because he was doing that. They don't stop to think about those things, and I wanted to write about them. It also gave me a chance to write about some very dramatic stuff. I mean, who would not want to go out west and write about forest firefighters? I was sort of planning out this list of things I would write about, and I'm like, God, smoke jumpers. I mean, if you can write about anything you want, why not write about things like smoke jumpers? And then I was going to do a chapter on war correspondence. And okay, I can go to, and I did. I went to Bosnia to work as a war correspondent and write about it. Just tremendous, as a writer, just these tremendously sort of fruitful topics, really dramatic topics. So these large forces of nature and occasionally of history that are just so dramatic and easy, in a way easy to write about. A firestorm, I found out how firestorms work. It's sort of a feedback loop, and the harder the fire is, the more wind it creates, which fans the fire and it gets even hotter. That stuff just fascinated me. They're all things, including history, things that can annihilate you, either in groups of thousands or individually. And I realized that having studied these, having written about these things, that the forces that can annihilate us are really the most interesting things there are. It's the most interesting question. And I felt very privileged to be able to write about them. The book I was going to write was going to be a collection on dangerous jobs. It ended up being a book on this storm. And what happened was, in late October, I was living in Gloucester with my girlfriend, and one afternoon, the wind got weirder and weirder. I mean, it got stronger and stronger, and the sounds coming out of the phone lines were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was this unearthly moan, really creepy. And we went outside, and the waves were coming up over our street, over Eastern Point Road. And we ran out to the back, where I limped, but we got our way out to the back shore, and there were these huge 30-foot waves rolling in and just destroying these houses and gouging out sections of the streets and flinging rocks inland. So we had to stand behind trees to watch them, where we risked being hit. It was the most awesome thing I'd ever seen. And I've been in, at this point, I've been in some very dramatic situations as a journalist, and nothing compares to those waves. And they were slow. They weren't fast. They were slow moving. And that was almost worse, because they were so slow, and you'd see them coming and coming and getting steeper and steeper. And then when they finally broke, it was just like, you could feel the ground shake. It was incredible. No, I think partly because I've never read, I'm going to start out reading this one particular section. I've never read it before. And I think because of the location where we're at, Maritime Museum, I feel like it's appropriate. However dangerous jobs are today, they were a lot more dangerous 100 years ago, 200 years ago. 10,000, as many as 10,000 men have been lost at sea from Gloucester alone. Gloucester today has 28,000 people. So I can't think offhand, I can't think of a town that has had that kind of casualty rate in anything. There's certainly no town that has given up that many men to all the wars combined. Even logging, as dangerous as it is, doesn't do that kind of damage. It's an incredible statistic, and that's because when storms hit the Grand Banks or Georges Bank, they could sink a dozen schooners. They'd be anchored. They were trying to ride out the storm, and if the anchor cable broke, they'd try to survive sailing, but they wouldn't be able to because the wind's too strong. They'd be smashed into another boat, and they'd go down. Having your anchor cable break in a storm on Georges Bank was almost guaranteed death. And this is how I started my book. The book is called The Perfect Storm, and this is the first chapter, sort of an introduction. It's called Georges Bank, 1896. Excuse me a second. One midwinter day off the coast of Massachusetts, the crew of a mackerel schooner spotted a bottle with a note in it. The schooner was on Georges Bank, one of the most dangerous fishing grounds in the world, and a bottle with a note in it was a dire sign indeed. A deckhand scooped it out of the water, the seagrass was stripped away, and the captain uncorked the bottle and turned to the assembled crew. Quote, "On Georges Bank, with our cable gone, our rudder gone and leaking, 2 men have been swept away and all hands have been given up as our cable is gone and our rudder is gone. The one that picks this up, let it be known, God have mercy on us." The note was from the Falcon, a boat that had set sail from Gloucester the year before. She hadn't been heard from since. A boat that parts her cable off Georges careens helplessly along until she fetches up in some shallow water and gets pounded to pieces by the surf. One of the Falcon's crew must have wedged himself against a bunk in the forecastle and written furiously beneath the heaving light of a storm lantern. This was the end, and everyone on the boat would have known it. How do men act on a sinking ship? Do they hold each other? Do they pass around the whiskey? Do they cry? This man wrote. He put down on a scrap of paper the last moments of 20 men in this world. Then he corked the bottle and threw it overboard. There's not a chance in hell, he must have thought. And then he went below again. He breathed in deep. He tried to calm himself. He readied himself for the first shock of sea. Now, I have a sort of interest in how people confront danger and confront their deaths. As a tree worker, I've worked on trees that I was absolutely sure were going to get me, hurt me or kill me, absolutely sure of it. But once you're doing this kind of work, any kind of work, you're locked into the sort of the mechanics of the process, and you can in a way, but you can't realistically suddenly say, no, I'm not going up this tree. What you do is you get or at least what I do is I get very fatalistic about it. And a lot of people do, and it's an interesting response. And that was one reason I started the book with that letter, with an account of the note in that bottle, because that was how one guy dealt with his mortality, was to try to, on the off chance that this bottle would be picked up, to try to communicate with his family and his friends. People say lost at sea. They don't say died at sea. They don't say they drowned at sea. They say they were lost at sea. And I don't think that's a coincidence. They really are lost in the sense that they're never found again. They never come back, and that's all you know. You don't know that they're dead. I mean, today you do, because there's modern communication. There are helicopters and search planes and stuff like that. Back then, there weren't. There were people who were lost off of schooners on dories, got blown out of range of the schooner. They would tub trawl off from dories off of on the Grand Banks. You'd have a mothership, and sometimes the fog would roll in, the dories would get blown out of range. Some guys ended up in Europe. They would drift clear across the Atlantic, end up in Europe, and they couldn't just pick up the phone and say, call home and say, hey, I'm okay. They couldn't do that. They might get home 6 months or a year later. One guy had to go all the way to Brazil on some kind of ship, and then up to Gloucester. It took him a year to get home, and he came walking up Main Street and knocked on his own door, said, I'm not dead. And so being lost at sea it's different. It's qualitatively different than dying in any other way. And even today, with the certainty that someone who's disappeared out at sea is dead, it still is very, very hard for people to get over it. And that was something I didn't realize until I started writing this book. And of course, I ended up, boy, as a journalist, what an awful corner to paint yourself into. I ended up with a contract to write a book about 6 guys who disappeared at sea. And my own little rule was that I couldn't fictionalize at all. There are some, quote, nonfiction books that are really more, based on the true story, a sort of a dramatic rendering. I didn't want to do that, so I couldn't fictionalize, and these guys disappeared. I have a few radio contacts. I've got some data buoy reports. Just for your information, the waves in this storm were over 100 feet high. I know hour by hour what the wind and waves were doing, and I have a few radio reports, and that's about it. And I had to reconstruct in dramatic fashion that hopefully would sell. I actually didn't think it had a chance in hell of selling. And neither did my publisher. But what that did was, it freed me up to write exactly the book I wanted to write. Is my first book. I just felt lucky to have a book contract. I was in Bosnia when my agent faxed me. He said, I sold your book. And the fax got to me, as you can imagine, sort of circuitous route. And I got it, and I was almost regretful. I thought, oh no, now I have to really do this. And I'm a writer, not a magician. I can't just pull this story out of a hat, and 300 pages, that's a long way to go with a story you don't know what happens. And so I came back and I realized what I could do, and maybe it would even be a more interesting book, is, okay, I don't have what happened to these guys on the Andrea Gale, and I guess I haven't mentioned that yet, a sword fishing boat from Gloucester. I learned the next day after watching these huge seas hit Cape Ann. The next day I found out a sword fishing boat from Gloucester, the Andrea Gale, 72 feet, steel-hulled commercial fishing boat, was lost, or was incommunicado. They couldn't raise her on the radio. She was coming back from the Grand Banks. Now these guys go out for, people, when I say sword fishing, often people think of sport, like sport fishing. These guys are not sport fishermen. They go out for a month, 5, 6 weeks at a time. They make $10,000, sometimes as much as $10,000 a month. And they come back, they've got a week on shore, and I assure you they live that to the fullest. And Gloucester's kind of built for that. There's a lot of waterfront bars, and these guys really pack a month of living, the living that they didn't do out at sea, they really pack it into that week. One of my problems as a journalist was to interview them sort of in their environment. I'm not a fisherman. I never worked as a fisherman. I've been out on boats, but I'm not a fisherman. And the best place to find these guys is in the bar. And particularly the Crow's Nest is where I ended up hanging out a lot, a wonderful place. And I finally ended up with a rule that I'd moved away from Gloucester at this point. I ended up with a rule that I couldn't do more than 2 days of research in a row in Gloucester. And I'm not just trying to be funny. I really couldn't take it. These guys, they drink so much, and I don't blame them. I would too if I lived like that. And if you're in the bar, you have to sort of keep pace with them. And so you'll be talking to some guy, drinking a beer, and it's okay. Usually I don't have anything to drink till it's dark out. It seems like that's a nice time to have a drink, is when it gets dark. And it's 11 in the morning, and I'm having a drink, but I'm like, okay, I'll do it for journalism, And so, we're talking, and then some guy comes in. He's just come in from offshore. He's been out for a month. He comes into the bar. He's ready to start enjoying his week on shore, and he buys the whole bar round. So now I have 2 beers in front of me, and then his friend comes in, and now there's 3 beers in front of me, and I've had 4 beers in front of me, and I'm drinking them fairly quickly. And one time I stopped in to ask Ethel Shatford, who is a bartender at the Crow's Nest. Unfortunately, very tragically, her son died on the Andrea Gale, which is why I started going to the Crow's Nest. She would sort of keep an eye out on me and make sure that the guys weren't sending me too many drinks, because I would be in there for hours and hours talking to these guys. But one day, I went in there to talk to her, and I was like noon maybe, and I just had a quick question to ask her, and then some guy walked in, and she said, "Oh, you got to talk to this guy. He knows all about fishing." So I started talking to him, and really sort of the next thing I knew, it was midnight. And throughout, I was there the whole afternoon, but I got a tremendous amount of information. I really wrote this book, a lot of it from hanging out in this bar and becoming to some extent, part of this bar. So, at any rate, I sort of went off on that tangent to tell you how I put this book together. I decided I can't know what happened on that boat, and in some ways it's better if I don't, because if I knew what happened on the Andrea Gale, all I would have is one story, because only one thing happened to that boat. Whatever it is, that's all that happened. I can't know that, so my responsibility to the readers as a journalist is to give them many different scenarios that all of which could have happened. And if I don't know what it's like to be in 70-foot breaking waves on a sword fishing boat, and I don't, thank God, and I can't interview these guys because they didn't come back, I felt it was legitimate to sort of say to the reader, okay, we can't know that, but there is a boat, the Mary T, for example, that survived. It was in 70-foot waves, and they didn't sink. And we can ask the captain of the Mary T, Albert Johnston, what was it like? What was your crew doing? What were you thinking? And I can say to the reader, that's probably what they were thinking on the Andrea Gale, something pretty close to that. And so what I ended up with was a kind of tapestry of different people's stories to tell one story. one probable story. And it ended up being a much broader book. It really is the story of many people. It's the story of fishing in general. And I didn't realize, I mean, when I started writing the book, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be difficult. And about halfway through, I started to realize, no, what seemed like a liability is absolutely going to save this book. Now, instead of having to give them the story of the Andrea Gale, I'm free to give them 3 stories about what it's like to be in 70-foot seas, and then 2 stories about what it's like to go down at sea, and then 4 stories about what it's like to drown, or whatever. It ended up being a tremendous opportunity. So I started thinking of it as a sort of journalism of equivalence. If I didn't know what happened, I could legitimately say, well, here's a similar situation. This is as close as we're going to get. The closest I could get, I mean, I wanted to take this all the way up to the point where they died, where they drowned. The closest I could get to what it's like to go down at sea and think you're going to die is a guy named Ernie Hazard. It's a great name for a guy that almost died at sea. In the early 80s, he was pitch-poled on a 55-foot lobster boat. Pitch-poled means he was flipped end over end. To do that, the wave has to be bigger than the boat. The wave was around 70 feet. And they went up, and the wave just laid them over on their back. And the next wave started to sink them. And he went from being in the wheelhouse looking at these huge waves to the next thing he knew, he was in complete darkness, upside down, in a flooded wheelhouse, 200 miles offshore, in late November with a lung full of air. Now, I felt that you could legitimately interview Ernie Hazard and find out, have a pretty good idea what someone's thinking when they're dead sure they're about to drown at sea. You can't come closer than Ernie Hazard and not actually drown. What happened with Ernie Hazard, and it's interesting, I was speaking earlier about how people face their deaths. They're strangely calm about it. These trees that I would do sometimes would kind of rattle me, but when it really is a moment of crisis, you're very, very calm. And Ernie Hazard decided that he had a job to do. In that moment, he's upside down in complete darkness, no idea even how to get out of the wheelhouse, you know. And he decided he had a job to do, and his job was to die. For the next couple of minutes, he wanted to do this job as well as possible. And that meant exhaling and getting on with it. But he also had friends and family, obviously, on shore, like we all do, and he decided he sort of owed it to himself or to them or whatever to try to escape once. He would swim in one direction, and if he got out of the wheelhouse, he'd keep trying to survive. And if he hit a wall, he'd let himself exhale. That was what he wanted to do, was exhale, and he cut a bargain with him, a deal with himself. And he swam in one direction, and he felt himself slide out through an opening. He has no idea what the opening was, a door or a broken window. And the next thing he knew, he popped up on the surface, basically in his underwear, again in late November, 200 miles offshore. And miracle of miracles, the life raft popped up next to him. And he climbed in, and when the life raft was tethered to the boat, and he was hoping other people might make it out of the boat. No one else did. I think there were 3 other guys. They died, 3 or 4 other guys. He waited until the boat started to go down, and then he cut the line and spent the next 2 days in the life raft up to his waist in winter ocean water, basically, getting flipped out of the raft, climbing back in, these huge, huge waves. He was finally picked up by the Coast Guard and rushed to a hospital. It's 2 days later. And when I flew out to California to interview him, because this is sort of my star witness. I mean, I felt like, his story is the story of the Andrea Gale, only he got out. And he put me up at his house. He's an incredibly nice guy, really sweet man. He's in his 50s now. And he, sort of towards the end of the interview, I said, Ernie, he was hospitalized for hypothermia. And I said, Ernie, how long did it take you to warm up? And I pictured, hypothermia means you're really cold, and I just pictured, put him in a hot bath, give him some hot chocolate, and well, how long can it take to warm up from that, and a few hours maybe. And I said, how long did it take you to warm up? And he really thought about it. He literally scratched his chin, because he was thinking back 15 years, and he said, 3 or 4 months. And the skin on his legs is still numb because the nerves were so badly damaged by the cold. At any rate, there's a talk of digressions, another long digression, just to really explain what I was trying to do with this book, how I thought I could tell a story about a story that couldn't be known. I'm going to read another section now. It's from, it's around when the storm is starting to hit these guys. Billy Tyne is the name of the skipper. I'm going to take another drink of water. I started each chapter with a quote. And this quote was from a historical document. It's from a book called Historic Storms of New England, 1891, and it describes a ship that was lost in 1839 off Newburyport. It started to go to pieces on the rocks right offshore, and the young men of town ran down to try and help the young men on board. They were only a few hundred yards apart, but it was huge winter seas. And they realized they could not get out there in their dories. And so the quote I thought was really a tragic and poetic passage describing the loss of this boat and this effort to save the men. The men could only look at each other through the falling snow from land to sea, from sea to land, and realize how unimportant they all were. There's a certain amount of denial in sword fishing. The boats claw through a lot of bad weather, and the crews generally just batten down the hatches, turn on the VCR, and put their faith in the tensile strength of steel. Still, every man on a sword boat knows there are waves out there that can crack them open like a coconut. Oceanographers have calculated that the maximum theoretical height for wind-driven waves is 198 feet. A wave that size could put down a lot of oil tankers, not to mention a 72-foot sword boat. Once you're in the denial business, though, it's hard to know when to stop. Captains routinely overload their boats, ignore storm warnings, stow their life rafts in the wheelhouse, and disarm their emergency radio beacons. Coast Guard inspectors say that going down at sea is so unthinkable to many owner captains that they don't even take basic precautions. We don't need an EPIRB, that's an emergency beacon. We don't need an EPIRB because we don't plan on sinking is a sentence that Coast Guard inspectors hear a lot. One of the videos on file with the Portland Coast Guard, shown as often as possible to local fishermen, was shot from the wheelhouse of a commercial boat during a really bad blow. It shows the bow rising and falling over mammoth, white-streaked seas. At one point, the captain says, a little smugly, "Yep, this is where you want to be. Right in your wheelhouse, your own little domain." I can tell you know what's coming. At that moment, a wall of water the size of a house fills the screen. It's no bigger than the rest of the waves, but it's solid and foaming and absolutely vertical. It engulfs the bow, the foredeck, the wheelhouse, and then blows all the windows out. The last thing the camera sees is whitewater coming at it like a big, wet fist. The farther you work from shore, the less smug you can afford to be. Any weekend boater knows the Coast Guard will pluck him out of whatever idiocy he gets himself into, but sword boats don't have that option. They're working 400 or 500 miles from shore, way beyond helicopter range. So Billy, any blue water fisherman, has a tremendous respect for the big wet fist. When Billy receives the weather chart off the fax machine, he undoubtedly tells the crew that there's something very heavy on the way. There are specific things you can do to survive a storm at sea, and whether the crew does them and how well they do them depends on how jaded they all are. Billy has fished his whole life. Maybe he thinks nothing can sink him, or maybe the sea is every nightmare he's ever had. A good worried crew starts by dogging down every hatch, porthole, and watertight door on the boat. That keeps breaking waves from busting things open and flooding the hold. They check the hatches on the lazarette where the steering mechanism is housed and make sure they're secure. A lot of boats founder when the lazarette floods. They check the bilge pump filters and fish out any debris floating in the bilge water. They clear everything off the deck, fishing gear, gaff pikes, oil slickers, boots, and put them down the fish hole. They remove the scupper plates so the boat can clear her decks. They tighten the anchor fastenings. They double lash the fuel and water barrels on the whaleback deck. They shut off the gas cocks on the propane stove. They lash down anything in the engine room that might break loose and cause damage. They press down the fuel tanks so that some are empty and others are as full as possible. That reduces something called free surface effect, liquid sloshing around in the tanks, changing the center of gravity. So far, the weather has been overcast but calm, light winds out of the northwest and a little bit of sea. Before the Portland gale of 1898, one captain reported that it was, quote, the greasiest evening you ever saw. And a few hours later, 450 people were dead. That it's not quite that calm, but almost. The wind hovers around 10 knots and a 6-foot swell rolls lazily under the boat. The Andrea Gale passes just north of Albert Johnston during the night. It's a boat I mentioned, the Mary T. that I talked to. And by dawn, they've almost made the western edge of the Grand Banks, around 52 degrees west. They're halfway home. Dawn creeps in with a few shreds of salmon pink sky, and the wind starts to inch into the southeast. That's called a backing wind. It goes counterclockwise around the compass and usually means bad weather is coming. A backing wind is an ill wind. It's the first distant touch of a low-pressure system going into its cyclonic spin. Then another weather fax comes in. Hurricane Grace will turn northeast and accelerate. Developing dangerous storm moving east 35 knots will turn southeast and slow by 12 hours. Forecast winds 50 to 65 knots and seas 22 to 32 feet. It reads like an inventory of things fishermen don't want to hear. An accompanying chart shows Hurricane Grace as a huge swirl around Bermuda and the developing storm as a tightly jammed set of barometric lines just north of Sable Island. Billy can either waste several days trying to get out of the way or he can stay on course for home. The fact that he has a hold full of fish and not enough ice must figure into his decision. He did what 90% of us would have done. He battened down the hatches and hung on, says Tommy Barry, captain of the Allison. Now the Allison was out there too, further to the east. And because the storm did something called retrograde, it didn't hit the rest of the fleet. If it had hit the rest of the fleet, 12 boats, the way it hit the Andrea Gale, they probably all would have gone down. That was the consensus of the guys who were out there. So Tommy Barry was on the radio to Billy Tide for a while. And I got a lot of my information on their last hours and days from the rest of the fleet that was out there on the radio to them. He did what 90% of us would have done. He battened down the hatches and hung on, says Tommy Barry, captain of the Allison. He'd been gone well over a month. He probably just said, screw it, we've had enough of this shit, and kept heading home. Now I'm going to skip ahead to when the boat has gone down, is starting to go down. Well, there are these dramatic, very dramatic rescues in this storm too that I don't think I'll have time to get to tonight. And I'm saying that just so you don't think the entire book is as grim as this section is about to be. People were saved offshore, and the stories are worth hearing. They're incredible stories. But this point comes about 2/3 of the way into the book, and it concludes the story of the Andrea Gale before I move on to these other stories. Whether the Andrea Gale rolls, pitch poles, or gets driven down, she winds up one way or another in a position from which she cannot recover. Among marine architects, this is known as the zero moment point, the point of no return. The transition from crisis to catastrophe is fast, probably under a minute, or someone would have tripped the EPIRB. Now the EPIRB, as I said, is an emergency beacon. You can call a mayday just by flipping a switch. It's very quick and easy. My guess is that they went down extremely fast because there was no signal from them. There's no time to put on survival suits or grab a life vest. The boat is moving through the most extreme motion in her life, and there isn't even time to shout. The refrigerator comes out of the wall and crashes across the galley. Dirty dishes cascade out of the sink. The TV, the washing machine, the VCR tapes, the men all go flying. And seconds later, the water moves in. When a boat floods, the first thing that happens is that her electrical system shorts out. The lights go off, and for a few moments, the only illumination is the frenetic blue of sparks arcing down into the water. It's said that people in extreme situations perceive things in distorted, almost surreal ways, and when the wires start to crackle and burn, perhaps one of the crew thinks of fireworks, of the last 4th of July, walking around Gloucester with his girlfriend and watching colors blossom over the inner harbor. There'd be tourists shuffling down Rogers Street, and fishermen hooting from bars, and the smell of gunpowder and fried clams drifting through town. He'd have his whole life ahead of him that July evening. He'd have every choice in the world. And he wound up sword fishing. He wound up by one route or another on this trip, in this storm, with this boat filling up with water, and 1 or 2 minutes left to live. There's no going back now, no rescue helicopter that could possibly save him. All that's left is to hope it's over fast. When the water first hits the trapped men, it's cold but not paralyzing, around 52 degrees. A man can survive up to 4 hours in that temperature if something holds him up. If the boat rolls or flips over, the men in the wheelhouse are the first to drown. Their experience is exactly like Hazard's, except that they don't make it out of the wheelhouse to a life raft. They inhale, and that's it. After that, the water rises up the companionway, flooding the galley and berths, and then starts up the inverted engine room hatch. It may well be pouring in the aft door and the fish hatch, too, if either fail during the sinking. If the boat is hull up and there are men in the engine room, they are the last to die. They're in absolute darkness, under a landslide of tools and gear, the water rising up the companionway and the roar of the waves probably very muted through the hull. If the water takes long enough, they might attempt to escape on a lungful of air, down the companionway, along the hull, through the aft door, and out from under the boat, but they don't make it. It's too far. They die trying. Or the water comes up so hard and fast they can't even think. They're up to their waists, and then their chests, and then their chins, and then there's no air at all, just what's in their lungs, a minute's worth or so. The instinct not to breathe underwater is so strong that it overcomes the agony of running out of air. No matter how desperate the drowning person is, he doesn't inhale until he's on the verge of losing consciousness. At that point, there's so much carbon dioxide in the blood and so little oxygen that chemical sensors in the brain trigger an involuntary breath whether he's underwater or not. That's called the break point. Laboratory experiments have shown the break point to come after 87 seconds. It's a sort of neurological optimism, as if the body were saying, holding our breath is killing us, and breathing in might not kill us, so we might as well breathe in. If the person hyperventilates first, as freedivers do, and as a frantic person might, the break point comes as late as 140 seconds. Hyperventilation initially flushes carbon dioxide out of the system, so it takes that much longer to climb back up to critical levels. Until the break point, a drowning person is said to be undergoing voluntary apnea, choosing not to breathe. Lack of oxygen to the brain causes a sensation of darkness closing in from all sides, as in a camera aperture stopping down. The panic of a drowning person is mixed with an odd incredulity that this is actually happening. Having never done it before, the body and the mind do not know how to die gracefully. So this is drowning, the drowning person might think. So this is how my life finally ends. Along with the disbelief is an overwhelming sense of being wrenched from life at the most banal, inopportune moment imaginable. I can't die, I have tickets to next week's game, is not an impossible thought for someone who is drowning. The drowning person may even feel embarrassed, as if he squandered a great fortune. He has an image of people shaking their heads over his dying so senselessly. The drowning person may feel as if it's the last, greatest act of stupidity in his life. These thoughts shriek through the mind during the minute or so that it takes a panicked person to run out of air. When the first involuntary breath occurs, most people are still conscious, which is unfortunate, because the only thing more unpleasant than running out of air is breathing in water. At that point, the person goes from voluntary to involuntary apnea, and the drowning begins in earnest. What I wanted to do with this book is describe in as great a detail as possible what killed these guys. everything from the history of Gloucester, which is a fishing town, so they were fishing, or there was a fishery for them to work in, to how waves work, how meteorology works, finally, what happens when you drown. The drowning part was the only section that I had any real first-hand experience with. I mean, part of the drowning section is based on other people's experiences, interviews with doctors, that kind of thing. I mean, I saw all these forces as kind of vectors that sort of converged to kill these guys at a certain point at a certain time. And I really wanted to explain how all of them worked. Someone described the book as a coroner's report, a very involved coroner's report in a way that's true. The drowning section was the only part that involved my own experience. I've surfed since I was a child. My main affection for the sea is via surfing. And a few years ago, I bought a winter wetsuit and was surfing in January. And I didn't know that the sandbars in the winter are different than in the summer. They're steeper, and when the waves hit them, they pitch forward in a way that they don't in the summer. And the same size wave, I would say, is about twice as powerful in the winter, and I didn't know this. And I was out there all by myself, late afternoon on Ballston Beach in Truro, beautiful place. I'd surfed there my entire life. The idea that you could die at Ballston Beach was just inconceivable to me. It was laughable. You sort of think you'll die in a dramatic place, but usually you don't, I guess. And a huge set of, it was a big day, I was way out, I was about ready to come in, and a huge set of waves came through. And the first one snapped the leash to my board, so now I'm just paddling around, swimming around out there, and the second one just drove me down to the bottom, and I could not get up. The turbulence was too strong. Usually, a wave breaks over you and you sort of get thrown around for a while. It's like being in it's been described as being in a big washing machine is exactly what it feels like. And if you just relax, eventually the turbulence has to dissipate and you come to the surface. It never did. It never let go of me. And it reminded me of another surfer described a very dangerous break in California called Mavericks that killed a world-famous surfer a couple of years ago. He said, the waves at Mavericks hold you down as if you owe them money. That's exactly what it felt like I owed somebody something. And what was going through a little bit of what goes through your mind was in this that I mentioned in this chapter was what went through my mind. Well, one paragraph of my experience that I put in there, I couldn't believe this was happening. And again, I started out talking about how people react to their own deaths, to what is going to annihilate them. My reaction was really interesting, and I'm going to, I guess, end the lecture with this thought. No one here has died before. No one has ever died. No one who can think about it has died, and so when you die, it's a completely new experience. You cannot believe it's happening. There's a sort of detachment. I guess that happens too, but at least in my experience, I was indignant that this can't be happening to me. And what was going through my mind was this sort of, one word was going through my mind, no, 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 no. That's what was going through my mind. It felt like the sea was carrying out a personal grudge. You can't, it's sort of easier to think that a wave could purposefully kill you because it doesn't like you than to think that the wave is just breaking and killing you completely by accident, without any intent at all. It just happens to be killing you while it's breaking you. That, in a way, is harder to accept than being killed on purpose. And I've heard that people who have been attacked by sharks do the same thing. The horrifying thing about it is the shark is not angry. It's a completely machine-like, it does not care particularly that it's killing you. And that is what's really horrifying, that your life can be snuffed out by something that really doesn't care. I personally couldn't believe it, I was fortunate enough to survive, to think about it, and then tell you guys about it. I sort of finally wound up on the beach and just lay there. I was all alone on the beach, it was January in Truro, and I was just lying there looking up at the clouds going by, just thinking, wow. At age 32, I guess, it had never struck me how much you lose when you die. I'm not a particularly religious person, and I personally feel when you die, that's it. And I was staggered by the immensity of what you lose. And even just a cloud, it's like, wow, I almost never got to see a cloud again. You know, I mean, in a way, a cloud isn't much. In a way, it's everything if you never get to see it again. And I just lay there thinking about clouds, about my family, and I feel like there's stages of maturity that people go through, and men have a weird phase of feeling totally sort of invulnerable. I mean, a lot of guys do, I think. So in their 20s, they're really reckless and feel kind of invulnerable. And I feel like the last stage, at least for men, or at least in my experience, is finally realizing that your life is valuable or even sacred, and to live accordingly. And I tried to write a book that, you know, these 6 guys who died, or pretty much died anonymously. You know, a lot of people might have thought that they weren't, you know, they didn't go to college, they didn't, you know, a lot of them were divorced. In a lot of ways, they were leading what could be thought of as failed lives. And I tried to write a book that countered that thought, that said, no, there's no such thing as a failed, I mean, if you're alive, it's a success. It's something of value. And these guys, as much as any Harvard graduate or anybody, their lives are worth describing, and their deaths are worth describing. And I tried to do as sort of detailed and obsessively accurate account of it as possible. And this is it. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. There's going to be a question and answer session now. And if you would come up to the mic, they're asking that people come up to the mic to ask questions. If that's hard for people to do, if you're in the middle of a row, I can also repeat the question if I can hear you, so speak up if you can't get out of your row.
I was very impressed with your description of the Air National Guard and the jumpers.
Yeah.
I thought that was talk about dangerous jobs and fellows who just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. These guys the Air National Guard rescue jumpers are incredible. And the Coast Guard, too. They jump out of helicopters into, 50-foot seas at times to save people. I mean, I won't go into it any more than that, just because we don't have that much time, but if you read the book, there's a whole section about an Air National Guard helicopter trying to save someone else. They had to ditch at sea in these huge, huge waves, 100 miles offshore at night because they ran out of fuel. They couldn't refuel from the tanker plane. They basically swam all night. When the Coast Guard cutter finally got to them, 205-foot cutter, the waves were so big that the guys on deck on the cutter were looking up at the guys in the water. They did not think they could get them on board. The guys in the water, or at least one of them, thought they were going to die within 20 feet of the cutter because they couldn't get on deck. The conditions were too violent. But they did. One guy was lost, but the other 4 survived.
While in the bar, interviewing, trying not to drink, were you tape recording all these conversations?
No, I had different kinds of interviews. A tape recorder is a difficult thing in a bar setting. People pay attention to it, and it's not, sometimes it gets in the way. Often what I would do, I have a sort of technique for remembering things as I'm having a conversation with someone. And if I can get into the bathroom, say in a bar, often enough to jot things down in a notebook, I can go for 20 minutes of even a pretty fruitful conversation and retain most of it. I mean, it's not the kind of accuracy you get out of a tape recorder, obviously, but it also, so you don't have that kind of accuracy, but you do get a lot more than you would with a tape recorder in that situation. It's a trade-off. When I got to know someone well enough, I would say, listen, it's really important to me to hear what you have to say and to make sure it's accurate. And I'd like to use a tape recorder. If we can meet sometime in your kitchen or something, I'd like to tape it. And usually they'd say yes. They would like the idea that I was interested in getting exactly what they said, and I was. So I would sort of pick and choose my moments, but in the bar, often I would just have a notebook in my back pocket, and I would just go to the bathroom, and you know, try to write it down. Yeah, well.
Congratulations, first of all. It's a magnificent book.
Thank you.
I'm curious as to what relationship you have with the women and the families of the men that drowned at this point now. And secondly, how has this changed you?
The book?
Yeah.
How has it changed me? Well, I'm here, for one. I got to know Ethel Shatford, the mother, quite well, and Chris Cotter, his girlfriend, and some of the other ex-wives. I got to know them by interviewing them, and then got to be friends with them, particularly the women in Gloucester. And it was concern over their reaction to the book that really worried me. After the book went to press, I just thought, I mean, I really got close to these people. I couldn't have written the book without them, without their help. There would not have been a book without them agreeing to help me. And you know, it's a portrait of Gloucester. I mean, it's a town that I love. It's also, I feel, a town with a certain amount of problems. There is a lot of drinking. You know, there used to be a huge drug problem. And I didn't want to give a glossy, romantic picture of Gloucester, I mean, in a way that's as unfair as really, you know, scorching the town critically. I didn't want to do either. And I was afraid that this sort of warts and all description of Gloucester would really offend people. I wouldn't have intended offense, but I was afraid that they wouldn't understand why I was putting in some of these sort of more sordid details. No one, not the families, not the women I interviewed, nobody reacted that way, which was a huge relief. So basically, to answer your question, I got to be quite good friends with them. They loved the book, and I feel it's a tremendous honor to have their approval for this book. In a way, it was absolutely more important to me than getting, you know, the New York publishing world to like it, which in some ways isn't that hard to do, you know? I mean, you know, they're comparing my book to other books. People in Gloucester are comparing my book on fishing to actual fishing, you know? That's a very scary comparison for a writer. So, and how has it changed me? Well, suddenly I'm leading this public life. You know, that's probably the biggest change. I'm sort of getting used to it. I miss being on my own. You know, I used to drive around the country in a station wagon, sleep out in the desert, and I used to do a lot of cool things. You know, and now it's really hard to find time to do that. I really want to get back to it. Yeah.
Why do you like danger and dangerous situations?
Well, in a way, it's sort of a simple, I don't mean to be glib, but danger is dramatic. It just is, you know? If you're in a dangerous situation, I mean, when I've done tree work, it really makes you feel alive to be in a situation where you might get hurt or you might get killed. You focus all of your senses and all your strength and all of everything gets focused on what you're doing. If you're 80 feet in a tree, or, you know, I was in Bosnia, if you're in some situations in a war, you're just so intensely aware that you're alive in the same way that I was after the near drowning experience. The same thing. I was lying there on the beach, I couldn't get over the fact I was alive. It was like a drug. Just the idea that I was alive was a drug. I mean, in some ways. Risk kind of works in the same way. There's a poet that I know said, risk is extra life. I just fell in love with that. It's absolutely true, you know. After a certain point, it's not. Risk is death, you know. I mean, too much of it is death, but the right amount is you just feel alive, and that's a feeling that, you know, everyone wants, I guess. Yeah.
From a meteorological standpoint, what was unusual about this storm? Why did it come to be? Was it a confluence of two or more storms, or was it a winter northeaster, or was it a hurricane?
Good question. I usually bring that up, and I forgot to tonight. A National Weather Service meteorologist who I interviewed, who tracked the storm, he tossed this term off. He said, "Oh, you know, it was a perfect storm," and it's not a meteorological term, but I sort of grabbed onto that. I was like, "Wow, that's an interesting expression." What he meant was that so many variables had to line up to produce a storm of this size, 100-foot waves, et cetera, that it was meteorologically perfect. He said you couldn't design a worse storm, for New England at least. A hurricane came up from the Caribbean, merged with a gale off the Great Lakes. Either storm would have been a big storm. They merged and turned into a huge storm, and that wasn't the end of it. Storms usually go west to east with the jet stream. So they spend a minimum amount of time over the coast. Well, this storm went west to east with the jet stream, and then it stopped and turned around. The jet stream had a kind of spasm because there was a third weather system called an anticyclone, basically a huge cold front, a high-pressure system, that forced this huge storm, forced it back towards the coast. It's called a retrograde. So it went offshore, it stopped, and turned around and hit the coast a second time. It was the second hit that really was devastating. And that is what this meteorologist, that was why he said it was a perfect storm. Otherwise, it just would have been a real big storm. It was the retrograde that, in his mind, really clinched it as quite a rare configuration of weather systems. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say the book was incredible. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And then I want to ask you, do you still surf?
Yes, I do, although I'm a lot more careful in the winter. I overestimate the waves rather than underestimate them. That's a new thing in my 30s. Yeah. You mean Linda? Yeah. He was saying that one of the most successful fisherwomen in Gloucester is a woman, Linda Greenlaw. I just spoke with her a few days ago, actually. Yeah, it's an industry of almost exclusively of men, and she started out, if I'm remembering right, she went to Colby College, she had a double major, and just fell in love with the sea. And just started fishing summers, and then got out of college, didn't want to pursue whatever it was she'd studied, I think government and economics or something like that, and started fishing, and is not only one of the only women in the industry, but one of the only women captains, and not only that, one of the very, very best captains in the entire sword fishing fleet. Everyone wants to fish with Linda Greenlaw, and to sort of top it off, she's just a fantastic person. I mean, you within 3 seconds of meeting her, you just think that I'm in the presence of a truly great, warm-hearted person. She's a fantastic person. I can't say enough. I didn't get to talk about her that much in the book, but she's a really tremendous person and a great fisherwoman. Yeah.
Yes, I grew up with Billy Tyne in
Oh,
Sully.
did you?
Yes, in Gloucester.
Oh my God.
And we hung out together at Tony's Corner. I don't know if did they ever mention Tony's Corner to you on Washington Street in Gloucester?
Tony's Corner, no.
Yes.
No.
But we grew up together. And I just want to thank you for writing this book, the Shatfords, and they're just terrific people. They had a hard life growing up, but they've always stuck together, and they're very family-oriented.
Yeah.
And I just love Gloucester. I've been out of Gloucester since I've been 27, well, 15 years. And my heart is always in Gloucester, in the sea.
Thank you very much.
My mother's packed fish. I just love Gloucester, and I love the book. Thank you.
Thank you, really. It really means a lot to me. Yeah. Took me about 3 years of, 2.5, 3 years of full-time work. I mean, it took longer than that, but if I compressed it, you know, if I sort of condensed it, probably 3 years, 2.5, 3 years of work. I was a year late turning it in. And no, I don't think I'll write a book on dangerous jobs. I like that topic. I think I'll keep writing about that kind of thing. I don't think I'll do it as a collection. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, actually. I mean, I have some ideas, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
How much distance was there between your proposal that the publisher accepted and the finished book?
He wants, I forgot I'm supposed to repeat questions when they're asked, not in front of the mic. He wants to know how much difference there was between my proposal and the finished book. It was pretty close. It was, I mean, I learned a few things as I was writing it, a few things I had to change, but it was pretty close. Yeah.
Haven't read the book yet, and assumably I will, but somebody asked earlier about your relationship with the survivors. I'm interested in the way you got connected with the men on the boat. Not having read the book, I would assume you get intimately connected with them. And are there any in particular that you really felt especially connected with, and why might that have been?
Yeah, okay. It sounds like this has to be the last question. Is that right? Okay. He wants to know about the men on the boat and how I sort of found out about them. If there are any that I sort of gravitated towards as the writer. I found out about them by interviewing their families and their friends. Some of the families didn't want to talk to me just because it's a painful topic. And those guys just did not get that well fleshed out in the book. I guess probably Bobby Shatford I sort of got closest to, if you can call it that. I got to know his girlfriend pretty well, and his mother. Between the two of them, I got a pretty good idea of who he was. And his brother, his younger brother too. And it affected me because I really was getting to know people who had died. And I was writing about them, and I almost felt like, I don't know, it was a strange process. And at one point, I wrote an article about the Andrea Gale. It was appeared in a magazine, and after the article, I sort of wondered what people in town thought about it. Most people liked it, a few people didn't. And I had a dream. I had a couple of dreams. One dream I was on the Andrea Gale, she was going down. I had a couple of very intense dreams about this boat, but one of them was I was on a beach, and the Shatford family was having a cookout. And Bobby Shatford was there, and he couldn't go to the cookout because he was dead. And he was apart. He was down the beach. There was a bluff and then this deserted beach, and he was apart from them. They were having a good time and singing and stuff, and he was apart from them. They had a fire, a bonfire, I think. And I walked up to him and I said, Bobby, I said, I'm Sebastian Younger. It's really, really good to meet you. And we shook hands. And he said, oh, he said, it's really good to meet you too. He said, you know, I really liked your article. And I said, you know, coming from you, that really means a lot to me. And so that sort of relieved a lot of my anxieties that, as you can imagine. I was really scared that I was somehow doing something bad in resurrecting these guys, and I was sort of chronically worried about that, and that helped. And then the response from Gloucester sort of finished it. I guess we have to stop now. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. As before stated, down those stairs over there we have a reception and a book signing to follow. I hope to see you all downstairs.